The first sign was not a sight, nor a scent, but a sound. An impossible sound that should never have been. A low rhythmic chant carried on no air, vibrating through the ancient stone like the whisper of a dead tongue. My name is Inquisitor Acustian Val, Ordo Malleus, and I have walked among war-plagued worlds and seen horrors I dare not record. Yet nothing unsettled me so quickly as that voice echoing beneath the Cathedral of St. Marcion. The recording had been transmitted to my secure channel 3 days prior, intercepted from a forgotten maintenance sublevel sealed for centuries. The pitch and cadence were perfect replicas of imperial liturgy, yet every syllable was wrong, like a reflection seen in a broken mirror. Our descent began at the base of the central spire, through incense-clogged tunnels once bustling with pilgrims but now abandoned. Even here among the ruins of faith, the air held a cloying sweetness, mixed with the sour reek of decay. The ash falls had grown heavier in recent weeks, layering every surface in grey that crumbled beneath our boots like ancient parchment. My retinue moved in silence behind me, 2 veteran acolytes armed with hellguns, a pair of Mechanicus tech priests, who muttered Binharic litanies under their breath, and Chaplain Eranos, whose Crozius clung to his fist like a drowning man's last prayer. The voxcaster on my belt hissed with static as we passed a fractured mural of the Emperor's Ascension. Eranos paused to trace the sigil of the Aquila, his gauntlet trembling. "This place has been abandoned too long," he murmured, voice barely audible through his respirator. I did not answer. I was already aware of the silence, not the natural quiet of empty halls, but a silence that seemed to swallow sound, to press it inward, trapping it inside your skull. At the first checkpoint, the Mechanicus scanned the sealed vault door barring the lower levels. Its surface was etched with wards so old they were worn smooth, their original meanings half erased by time. Structural integrity compromised, one tech priest reported, his voice clicking through a vox synth. Energy readings anomalous. Temperature variance, 23 degrees below baseline. I frowned. There was no visible frost, no mist. The air was simply wrong, colder without cooling. When the locking mechanisms disengaged, they did so with a groan that echoed endlessly downward, as if the door were crying out in protest. We stepped into darkness, lit only by our lumen strip. The corridor ahead stretched impossibly far, its walls smooth and symmetrical like the ribcage of some buried god. I counted my steps, trying to measure the distance, but after 140 paces I realized we had not drawn any closer to the far wall. The geometry twisted subtly, yet visibly in ways that defied reason. Behind us, a vox unit crackled with sudden life, spewing a distorted whisper. We froze, weapons ready. The voice that emerged was impossibly close, though no one stood near. It spoke only 4 words, each one drawn out, soaked in malice. "We are already inside." No one spoke as the words faded into the stale, ash-laden air. Even the tech priests, who usually cloaked their fear in machine logic recitations, fell silent. I raised a hand, signaling the retinue forward, though every instinct urged me to turn back. Duty compelled us downward. The corridor sloped gradually at first, then more steeply, leading us into a labyrinth of sub-chambers long forgotten by any living soul. Each step stirred the ash beneath our boots, releasing motes that hung in the beam of our illuminators like frozen smoke. As we advanced, the silence thickened. It was as though the air itself pressed inward, smothering sound. When someone spoke, their voice seemed to fall flat, absorbed before it could echo. The only constant was the faint, rhythmic hum beneath our feet, as if something vast and hidden stirred far below. The first anomaly manifested when we crossed a threshold marked by ancient ecclesiastical seal. There was no visible mechanism, yet when we passed through, the temperature plummeted. My breath should have fogged before me, but it did not. Even the ash remained inert, undisturbed. It was a cold without frost, a chill that came from absence rather than ice. The Mechanicus initiated scans, their Auspex devices emitting a chorus of metallic chirps. The readings returned were nonsensical, negative density recorded, one priest reported, voice flat but straight. Spatial hollows detected beneath primary structure, volumes exceeding known cathedral design. His mechanical eye whirred, focusing on nothing I could see. "There is space missing, Inquisitor," reality excised. I forced myself to ignore the implications and pressed onward. The architecture shifted subtly with each passageway. At times the hallways narrowed to claustrophobic tunnels, at others they widened into grand reliquaries, where broken icons lay scattered among the dust. One chamber drew us to a hole. 100 reliquary pedestals stood in perfect rows, each meant to house relics of saints long dead. Most were empty, but a few still cradled brittle remains, femurs wrapped in gold filigree, skulls encased in crystal. As we moved between them, a breath of unseen wind passed through the room. Though no door or vent existed, the relics began to rise, one by one as if lifted by invisible hand. They did not tumble or float aimlessly, but aligned themselves in a perfect vertical pattern, bones stretching heavenward like supplicants. Chaplain Eranos fell to his knees, chanting the Emperor's benediction in a hoarse, terrified voice. Then another voice joined his, a thin, high-pitched murmur from Acolyte Meriden. His eyes were unfocused, lips moving in perfect rhythm, with Eranos yet forming words entirely alien. It was the same impossible chant we had heard in the recording, now spilling from a mortal throat. I grabbed Meriden's shoulders and shook him hard. "Break it," I roared. His body went rigid, and for a moment the chamber itself seemed to shudder. The relics clattered to the ground all at once, the sound echoing unnaturally long before fading into silence. Meriden collapsed, gasping like a man nearly drowned. "I saw them," he whispered. "They were praying, but not to him, never to him." Before I could question him further, the Auspexes screamed. The Mechanicus priests turned their senses downward, their metallic voices rattling off rapid calculations. "Movement detected below this level," one announced. "A vertical shaft. Extreme depth. Unknown terminus." We followed the signal through a narrow archway that descended into a final antechamber. The walls here were smooth and black, utterly devoid of iconography or scripture. At the chamber's center yawned an elevator shaft plunging into absolute darkness. There was no visible machinery, no cables, only an empty void, and at its base, impossibly far below, a single candle flame burned steady and bright. Its light did not waver, did not flicker, though no draft reached this place. Acolyte Meriden clutched at my arm, his voice breaking. "Inquisitor, there's nothing to stand on, no platform, no floor." I stared into that perfect, unwavering light and felt the weight of countless unseen eyes pressing upward from the depths. Whatever waited below, it had been awake long before our descent, and now it knew we were here. We descended into the darkness, one step at a time. The elevator, a crude platform of adamantium hastily secured by the Mechanicus from rusted scaffolding and chains scavenged from the upper vaults. The improvised contraption groaned under our weight as the winches activated, carrying us downward into the abyss. The lone candle far below burned ever steady, never wavering, a fixed point in an ocean of black. The shaft walls seemed to close in as we sank, smooth stone giving way to corroded metal, then to a material that defied identification, neither natural nor forged. The chanting began again as we descended, distant at first, like the memory of a hymn half remembered. It swelled gradually until it pressed against our skulls like a physical force. Unlike before, fragments of recognizable imperial high Gothic emerged among the alien syllables, warped and stretched, as if holy verses were being fed through a blasphemous tongue. Chaplain Eranos clutched his crozius so tightly that blood seeped between his armored fingers, whispering counter prayers under his breath. Acolyte Meriden began to weep silently, his tears streaking trails through the ash smeared across his face. Halfway down, the Mechanicus priest handling the winch froze, his augmetic limbs locking as streams of corrupted data filled his vox speaker. "Anomaly detected," he rasped. "Telemetry compromised. Spatial mapping returns negative mass readings. Sections of reality are absent." His mechanical eye rotated wildly as he struggled to interpret the impossible figures scrolling across his displays. "Inquisitor, the structure beneath us does not exist in any rational form. Portions are cut out." His voice faltered. The platform swayed, the groan of chains echoing into endless dark. I forced the descent to continue, though every instinct screamed to halt. At last the candle's glow swelled until it illuminated a cavern so vast that it seemed to swallow the light whole. As we drifted to the floor, our illuminators revealed the outlines of figures standing in perfect rows, stretching into the gloom. At first, I thought them statues, monuments to forgotten saints, but as we approached, dread settled like ice in my chest. They were not statues, they were bodies. Their skin had petrified into stone-like hardness, their features frozen mid-scream. The hollow pits of their mouths gaped in silent agony, and each throat had been neatly removed, leaving nothing but smooth, featureless flesh where the voice should have been. Their armor and vestments were so ancient that even the Mechanicus could not identify their origins. When Eranos examined a fragment of breastplate, he whispered that the design predated even the Horus heresy, perhaps reaching back to the Great Crusade. We moved cautiously among them, our boots crunching on fragments of black crystal scattered like shattered glass. The silence here was total, suffocating, even the earlier chanting replaced by a heavy stillness that made breathing seem sacrilegious. I ordered samples to be taken, though none dared touch the stone flesh directly. Then, from somewhere deep within the ranks of the petrified figures, a whisper rose. It was not carried on air but forced directly into our minds, bypassing ears and vox entirely. It spoke my name. I spun toward the source, weapon raised. One of the figures had shifted. The motion was slight, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a cascade of stone flakes tumbling from its form. Its head had turned, just a fraction, the crack of breaking stone sharp as a rifle shot in the silence. Its hollow, featureless face angled toward me, as the whisper repeated itself, louder now, more insistent. Veil. Erenos shouted a litany of banishment and swung his crozius in a wide arc, striking nothing but air. Acolyte Meriden screamed and fired blindly into the dark, his shots illuminating the chamber in strobing flashes. In those fleeting bursts of light, I saw movement, not one figure but many, their heads shifting, bodies creaking as though straining to awake. The whisper became a chorus, dozens of voices merging into one dreadful harmony. Veil, they intoned, in perfect unison. My breath caught. They were not calling my name as a warning or threat. It was recognition, a greeting delivered across an abyss of time and memory. My mind reeled with the impossible implication, even as the Mechanicus slammed the winch into reverse. The platform jerked violently upward, chains screeching. As we rose, the figures below slowly raised their arms, not to attack, but to... The last sight before the darkness swallowed them was a forest of stony hands stretching toward us, fingers grasping at nothing, and the echo of that dreadful chorus rising to fill the shaft. It followed us upward, even as we fled, until it felt as though the entire cathedral itself was whispering my name. The ascent felt agonizingly slow, each jolt of the chains rattling through my bones. The chorus of voices diminished as we rose, fading back into the oppressive silence of the upper vaults. When we finally reached the landing, the entire retinue stumbled off the platform, breath ragged, eyes wide with the terror we dared not voice. Erenos collapsed to one knee, reciting broken fragments of the litany of repudiation. Acolyte Meriden clung to the shaft's edge, trembling so violently that I feared he might throw himself back into the darkness rather than face what we had seen. I ordered the Mechanicus to seal the shaft. They complied without protest, welding ancient plating across the opening, while their metallic voices repeated machine prayers meant to ward against corruption. The scent of burning metal filled the chamber, thick and acrid, masking the ever-present sweetness of the air. Once it was done, I forced the team into a temporary command post, a small reliquary hall where the walls still bore faded murals of saints long dead. It offered no true safety, but even the illusion of sanctuary was precious now. The tech priests began analyzing their data, spreading out rune-etched hololith projectors that bathed the walls in pale blue light. As the images resolved, my breath caught. The patterns were unmistakable. What at first seemed like random architectural layouts were in fact a vast, interlocking network of symbols and lines. The foundations of the cathedral had been designed as a colossal map, a ritual geometry that spanned miles beneath the hive. The realization was staggering. We had always believed this cathedral to be a sacred monument to the Emperor's glory. Now, confronted with these images, it appeared more like a containment device, a prison built to bind something ancient and terrible. Erenos traced one glowing line with his gaunt. These shapes, they are heretical. Some resemble the sigils of banishment used by the Ordo Melius. Yet others predate imperial faith entirely. His voice faltered. Inquisitor, what could require a ritual of this magnitude? The Mechanicus were no less disturbed. One tech priest emitted a series of sharp Banharic clicks before translating into low Gothic. These geometric nodes align with no human system. Several formations match stellar coordinates outside the galaxy itself. Some of these markings are older than the Imperium, older perhaps than mankind. His lenses swiveled toward me, trembling slightly as if the machine spirit within him resisted the knowledge he now possessed. As they spoke, I paced the chamber, the weight of understanding pressing heavier with each step. The relics we had seen, the petrified figures without throats, the chanting that mimicked our own prayers, these were not isolated phenomena. They were pieces of a vast and intricate design. Somewhere deep beneath us lay the central locus, the heart of this impossible construct. The Vox units began to malfunction then, a sudden burst of static tearing through the room. At first, I thought it was interference from the Mechanicus devices, but the pattern was too deliberate. Messages we had transmitted earlier in the mission began to play back in distorted fragments. My own voice echoed from the speaker, issuing commands I had given hours ago. Then came responses we had not yet made, as if the future and past were bleeding into one another. A single phrase repeated itself through the distortion, rising in clarity until it filled the room. 7. The voice was not human, yet it carried an uncanny mimicry of prayer, each utterance perfectly spaced, like a liturgical chant. One of the dead servitors we had brought for analysis shuddered violently, its lifeless frame rising from the floor. Its eyes glowed faintly as it repeated the same word, 7, over and over, in perfect unison with the vox. Eranos struck it down with his Crozius, smashing the machine's skull in a shower of sparks and black. The words ceased instantly, leaving a silence that felt somehow worse than the sound itself. My pulse pounded in my ears as I turned back to the hololith projection. The glowing map pulsed faintly, and in that moment, I understood. The pattern's exact center point aligned perfectly with the cathedral's main altar room above us. It was not a coincidence. The sacred heart of the structure had been deliberately placed to seal whatever lay beneath. A terrible thought took hold, one I dared not speak aloud. If the altar was the seal, then our presence here, our movements and actions, might be unraveling it. The cathedral had not merely been built as a place of worship, it was a weapon and a prison, and something within it was stirring, reaching upward. Before I could voice my fears, the ground trembled beneath our feet. Dust rained from the ceiling as a low resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through our bones. The Mechanicus scrambled to stabilize their equipment while Eranos shouted orders over the growing din. I stared at the hololith as the lines shifted, the central node pulsing like a beating heart. The cathedral was no longer a map, it was waking up. The tremors subsided as suddenly as they had begun, leaving only the harsh rasp of our breathing and the residual hum echoing through the stone. No one spoke. Even the tech priests, who normally filled silence with ritual binharik, were mute, their augmetic limbs twitching with nervous spasm. I forced myself to move first, to remind them that fear had no place here, though inside I felt the same creeping dread. The hololith continued to flicker behind me, the cathedral's vast geometry pulsing faintly like a living thing. Whatever had caused that vibration had been no natural quake. It was deliberate, measured, as if answering a call we could not yet hear. Eranos approached, his face pale beneath the layer of ash. "Inquisitor," he said, his voice low and hoarse, "the node you identified beneath the altar, it must be investigated. If it is weakening, we need to know why." His hand trembled on the haft of his Crozius, "and we must know what it contains." Reluctantly, I agreed. There was no longer any safe path, only necessary one. The Mechanicus confirmed a route through a series of sealed chambers directly beneath the sanctum. The seals had been untouched for centuries, their designs a blend of ancient ecclesiastical script and machine code so archaic it predated their own order's record. It took nearly an hour to force them open, every strike of the welding torches echoing too loudly in the enclosed tunnels. The final barrier parted with a hiss of escaping air, revealing a passage that smelled of old incense and decay. The temperature dropped sharply as we entered, though once again there was no frost, only an unnatural stillness that chilled the skin without any sign of condensation. The walls here were different, smooth, seamless, and glistening, as if perpetually wet. Our lumen beams reflected off their surface, scattering in strange patterns that made the corridor seem to writhe as we passed. No inscriptions or icons marked these stones. They felt wrong, as though they had grown rather than been built. We followed the passage until it ended at a set of immense black doors, their surfaces etched with runes that twisted uncomfortably when viewed directly. At their base, a single iron chain stretched across the threshold. The links were the width of a man's wrist, blackened and pitted, yet clearly forged with great care. Tiny inscriptions covered every surface of the metal. Fragments of prayers, fragments of equations, fragments of something older than I. The Mechanicus examined the chain with their auspex, muttering binharik that dissolved into static. Containment device, one finally rasped. Dual inscriptions, faith and logic intertwined. A perfect balance. He hesitated, something like awe creeping into his voice. Whatever lies beyond required more than human design. We crossed the threshold with deliberate steps, weapons ready. The vault beyond was vast, its ceiling lost in darkness. Chains like the one at the entrance stretched across the chamber, crisscrossing overhead like the web of some titanic creature. Beneath them stood rows of pillars, each capped with what I first mistook for stone urns. Closer inspection revealed them to be skulls, their eye sockets filled with molten gold that dripped slowly to the floor. The air was thick with a cloying humidity, a scent both sweet and rancid, like incense mingled with rotting meat. As we moved deeper, a faint sound reached my ear. At first, it was only a tremor at the edge of perception, then a distinct noise, a slow rhythmic dripping. I tracked it to one of the massive chains. From its surface oozed a viscous fluid the color of dark wine. It gathered at the lowest point of each link before falling, drop by drop, into a pool beneath. When one drop struck, the sound was amplified 100-fold, echoing through the vault like a scream. The first chain snapped without warning. It did not break with force or violence, but simply separated, as if some unseen will had commanded it to part. The sound that followed was not metallic, but organic, a wet tearing that set my teeth on edge. The released chain recoiled into the darkness above, vanishing from sight. Immediately the statues, no, the pillars, began to shift. The skulls atop them turned slowly, liquid gold pouring from their mouths like a river. Acolyte Meriden clutched his head and began to speak in a voice not his own, reciting fragments of a confession. None of us understood. The words tumbled out in a fevered rush, broken syllables layered atop one another in a dissonant harmony. Erinos bellowed a warding prayer, and struck one of the pillars with his crozius. It shattered, releasing a gout of black steam that filled the air with the scent of burned flesh. The other pillars screamed, not with mouths or voices, but through the very walls around us. The sound was unbearable, a chorus of agony vibrating through the stone, until my vision blurred. Another chain snapped, then another. Each time the vault shuddered violently, dust and ash raining from above. The Mechanicus scrambled to stabilize their scanners, shouting about containment collapse and failure points, but their words were lost in the din. I shouted for retreat, though even my own voice felt distant and thin. Amid the cacophony, we fled toward the entrance, as the final chain began to strain, its links warping under invisible pressure. Just before we reached the threshold, it gave way with a deafening crash. Something vast and unseen stirred in the darkness behind us. I did not look back. I couldn't. All I allowed myself was one final glance at the threshold as we sealed the doors, and in that fleeting moment, I saw dozens of golden skulls rising into the air, their empty sockets burning like twin suns. We sealed the vault behind us with every barrier we could muster, welding plates, carving wards into the metal, and layering them with desperate prayers that tasted hollow in my mouth. Even as the final seals were etched, I knew it would not be enough. The weight of the thing behind those doors pressed against my thoughts like a hand on the back of my skull. The others felt it too. Erinos staggered, his crozius clattering to the floor as he gripped his temples and muttered broken fragments of catechism. The tech priests emitted distorted binharik, their mechanical limbs jerking out of rhythm as if an unseen force were rewriting their flesh and steel alike. We retreated from that cursed hall, our steps uneven and hurried. The corridors twisted strangely now, bends and angles that had not been there before. I recognized this subtle wrongness from ancient accounts of warp taint, the reshaping of space according to will not our own. The reliquary hall where we had established our command post was no longer as we left it. The murals of saints had peeled away from the walls, curling like old parchment, leaving behind blank stone that seemed to pulse faintly. More disturbing still, the petrified figures from the depths were gone. Only perfect, circular indentations in the ash marked where their feet had stood. The Mechanicus swept the area with Auspex readings, and their findings chilled me further. They reported multiple moving entities occupying identical coordinates, overlapping yet not colliding. This cannot be, one rasped, its vox sputtering. They are here and not here, occupying parallel layers. As he spoke, his voice began to falter, fragments repeating and reversing like corrupted data. The Auspex wailed, then abruptly died. The chanting began again, low and insistent, emanating from no discernible source. It grew in perfect synchronization with the rhythm of our heartbeats until my chest ached with the unnatural harmony. Erinos fell to his knees, pressing both hands over his ears, but it did nothing to block the sound. Acolyte Meriden screamed and fired blindly into the shadow. His shots tore through a cluster of hanging incense chains, revealing for an instant a nightmare shape illuminated in the muzzle flashes. It loomed at the far edge of our illuminator's reach, a figure impossibly tall, its body a patchwork of choir robes stitched together with fragments of bone. Dozens of skulls hung where a head should have been, their empty sockets glowing faintly red like smoldering coals. As it moved, the robes whispered across the floor like parchment on stone,
and its many limbs unfolded with a hideous grace. The sound of the chanting surged, vibrating through my teeth. The entity did not advance directly, instead it swayed, its movements precise and rhythmic, as though it conducted an invisible choir we could not see. The walls trembled with each motion, dust sifting down in slow cascade. Behind me, one of the tech priests collapsed, his body convulsing as a deep, resonant tone erupted from his vox speaker. A voice so low it was more felt than heard. It was not his own voice, it could not be. All light sources failed in that moment. Our illuminators winked out, plunging us into absolute darkness. Even the glow from the Auspex readings vanished. The only illumination came from the faint red embers within those suspended skulls. Shapes stirred in the darkness beyond, their outlines barely perceptible. They moved with the same rhythmic precision as the towering creature, each motion echoing like a drumbeat within my skull. I shouted for retreat, my voice breaking the oppressive rhythm for a single heartbeat. Eranos seized on the disruption, roaring a battle hymn as he surged forward, swinging his Crozius in wide, blazing arc. The weapon's head flared, scattering fragments of light that revealed glimpses of the horror surrounding us. Dozens of robed figures pressed tight against the walls, their faceless heads tilted in unison, mouths opening and closing in perfect silence. Mirrodin stumbled, his scream lost in the overwhelming hum. The red glow intensified, and suddenly the chamber itself seemed to inhale. The air rushed inward, pulling at our clothes and flesh. My ears popped painfully as if reality itself were collapsing into that central figure. It raised its limbs high, and the silent choir moved as one, their collective gesture filled with dreadful reverence. The tech priest's deep voice grew louder, nearly unbearable now, a single unending note of inhuman resonance. My vision blurred, blood dripping from my nose. I fired blindly toward the source of the sound, but my shots vanished into nothingness. Eranos reached the fallen tech priest and drove his Crozius down with a wordless bellow. The note cut off instantly, leaving a void so profound that my heart seemed to stutter in my chest. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been. Then, from somewhere deeper within the cathedral, a new voice rose, faint, distorted, yet unmistakable. It was my own voice, calling my name in a tone of calm authority, but I had not spoken. The towering figure turned toward me, and though it had no eyes, I felt its focus like a physical weight. The choir of faceless acolytes parted to either side, creating a narrow path leading deeper into the darkness. The air thrummed with expectation, as though the cathedral itself awaited my next step. Behind me, Eranos hissed a prayer through clenched teeth. "Inquisitor," he whispered, his voice shaking, "it wants you to follow." And though every rational part of me screamed to flee, I felt my foot slide forward, drawn by an unseen pull. As the shadows ahead pulsed like the heartbeat of a living god, I forced my foot to still, breaking the trance with a ragged breath. The thing before us swayed gently, its robe-like flesh undulating in rhythm with the steady pulse of the walls. The faceless congregation shifted in perfect unison, their heads tilting slightly, a motion so precise it seemed mechanical. The silence pressed in on us, heavy and absolute, broken only by the distant, lingering echo of my own voice that had come from nowhere. My retinue stood rigid, trapped between terror and obedience, like marionettes awaiting a final command.
"Fall back," I ordered, my voice barely more than a whisper, but the sound was mine and mine alone. Eranos seized Mirrodin by the arm, dragging him bodily as the acolyte resisted, eyes glassy and unfocused. The path between the robed figures remained open, inviting, but none of us dared tread it. We stumbled backward, weapons raised, until the oppressive presence of the entity faded enough for my lungs to expand again. Only when we reached the outer corridor did I allow myself to glance back. The figures had not pursued. They simply stood there, perfectly still, as if frozen mid-gesture, their attention fixed solely on the darkness deeper within. It was not relief I felt at this sight, but dread. They were guardians, not hunters. Whatever lay beyond them did not need to move. It was waiting for us to come to it. We regrouped in a side chamber. The Mechanicus tech priests busied themselves with repairing their auspex, their metallic hands trembling as they worked. Eranos knelt in prayer, his voice hoarse, his once orderly litanies fractured and repetitive. I turned to check on the surviving priest whose voice had been stolen moments before. His body lay sprawled on the cold stone, lifeless, but there was no blood, no sign of external violence. With grim determination, I ordered an examination. When his chest plate was removed, the true horror revealed itself. There were no organs within. His ribcage had been hollowed out entirely, every cavity filled with tiny structures fashioned from bone, miniature cathedrals complete with spires, arches and windows no larger than the head of a pin. They were arranged in perfect symmetry, a city of death built within a single body. Erinos recoiled, whispering prayers of exorcism. Meriden vomited noisily, retching until only dry sobs remained. I stared, fighting to keep my mind steady, and a fragment of ancient scripture surfaced unbidden. Sin must be given form lest it dissolve into thought. It struck me then this cathedral was not a building in the traditional sense. It was a mechanism, a vessel of memory and guilt given physical shape. The figures we had seen were not simply victims. They were components, like cogs in a vast machine, their flesh and bone shaped into architecture by a force beyond comprehension. As the others recovered, I pored over the Mechanicus scans, demanding clarity despite their faltering spirits. The data they had gathered painted a picture more terrible than I dared speak. The cathedral was shifting, subtly rearranging its own structure. Hallways that had been sealed now opened, while others vanished entirely. Entire wings moved like pieces on a game board, aligning according to patterns too complex for the human mind to fully grasp. While they explained, the vox crackled. A transmission came through from one of the surface units we had left stationed above. The voice was frantic, distorted by interference, but the message was unmistakable. The upper cathedral was changed. Witnesses described walls folding inward, altars splitting apart, and statues turning themselves inside out. Pilgrims had begun rioting, claiming to see visions in the ash storms. The last coherent report described a column of light erupting from the altar room before the channel went dead. I felt the blood drain from my face. The central seal we had identified, the locus of the entire pattern, was failing. Whatever was bound here was no longer content to remain buried. I turned to Erinos and Meriden. Their faces were pale, haunted, but they understood as I did. There was no more time for study or hesitation. We returned to the surface, I said, voice steady despite the weight of the words. The cathedral above is no longer merely a house of worship, it is awakening, and its voice will not remain silent. The moment we stepped back into the main passage, a tremor rippled through the floor, nearly throwing us off our feet. The once still air vibrated with a low thrumming resonance that rose from deep below, a sound too vast to belong to anything mortal. The corridors warped as we ran, turning upon themselves like living things, forcing us to retrace our steps through shifting routes that mocked our every effort. As we reached the final ascent, a cold certainty settled over me. The cathedral was no longer a prison. It was becoming something new, something whole, and we were inside its body, moving through its veins like unwanted invaders. When we emerged into the ashen light of the upper spire, the first thing I saw was the sky. It was wrong. The clouds above had split into concentric circles, rotating slowly, their centers glowing faintly red. From the heart of the cathedral came a deep reverberating note that seemed to shake the world itself. The Mechanicus voxed desperately to their remaining surface team, but only static reply. I stared at the warped heavens and realized with bone-deep certainty that we were witnessing the cathedral's true form, and that it was still rising from its long slumbering dream. The ashen sky churned above us, a vast spiral of storm clouds, rotating with a precision too deliberate to be natural. The concentric rings bled light in shades of crimson and gold, casting the cathedral's spires in a ghastly glow. The air stank of burned incense and ozone, so thick it clung to my tongue. At first I thought the trembling beneath my boots was another quake, but then the ground rippled like water, and I realized with dawning horror that it was not the earth that moved. It was the cathedral itself, flexing and shifting beneath our feet like some colossal breathing organism. Erinos bellowed a warding litany, his voice swallowed by the rising wail of distant sirens. Pilgrims and lesser clergy spilled into the plazas, screaming prayers or fleeing blindly into the ash storms that raged beyond the wall. The spire at the center of the complex began to split along hidden seams, stone unfolding with a sound like breaking bone. Altars cracked open, releasing streams of viscous black fluid that hissed when it touched the ground. Statues once revered now moved on their own, twisting grotesquely, some walking on inverted limbs while others shattered into clouds of fine dust that swirled into the storm. We forced our way through the panicked crowd, weapons raised, unsure who among them was innocent, and who had succumbed to the corruption blooming around us. Many bore the marks of transformation, eyes bleeding, skins stretched taut, as if something beneath struggled to emerge. Others simply collapsed mid-run, their bodies folding inward until they became little more than heaps of ash and bone. The Mechanicus voxed warnings to the surface guard, but only static returned. The chain of command above had disintegrated. At the base of the grand stairs leading to the altar, a group of fanatics barred our path. Their bodies were twisted with mutations,
mouths fused into gaping, vertical maws that emitted a single, droning note. The pitch of it vibrated through my teeth, threatening to drive me mad. Meriden faltered, clutching his skull, and would have fallen had Erenos not dragged him forward. With a roar the chaplain charged, Crozius blazing, smashing the warped forms aside in a spray of black ichor. We followed close behind, cutting through the last of the maddened pilgrims. As we fought our way to the base of the central spire, the door to the altar chamber was gone, torn away by forces unseen. Beyond lay ruin. The chamber we had studied on the hololith was barely recognizable. Its marble floors had buckled, the altar itself shattered into a jagged pit that descended into infinite darkness. The smell was overpowering, a mix of incense, rot, and something metallic, sharp enough to sting the lung. My eyes watered as I realized the darkness below was not absence, but movement shapes shifting far beneath, writhing in patterns I could not comprehend. The entire structure trembled again. A fissure tore through the nave, splitting it from wall to wall. Choir stalls toppled like children's toys, their ornate carvings crushed beneath falling debris. The spire above groaned like a wounded giant. I barked orders to retreat, but the floor beneath us had begun to rise and fall in violent waves. We scrambled for footing as the great stained glass window behind the altar imploded inward, a storm of razor-sharp shards slicing through fleeing pilgrims. The ash storm outside poured in, mingling with the black smoke that belched from the widening pit. Through the haze I glimpsed forms climbing the walls, figures like those we had seen below, their bodies a patchwork of robes and bone fragments. They swarmed upward, their limbs bending backward, claws digging into stone as they ascended. The mechanicus shouted over the din, their voices cracking with mechanical distortion. The structure is realigning, lattice collapse imminent. If it completes, the entire hive level will fall into the subchamber. Their words barely registered before a violent tremor threw us all to the ground. I tasted blood as my teeth cut my tongue, the copper tang grounding me in the chaos. I pulled myself up and dragged Meriden toward the exit. Erenos held the rear, his Crozius a blazing beacon amid the swirling ash. As we reached the plaza, a final deafening crack resounded. The central spire split cleanly down the middle, each half folding outward like a blooming flower. From its heart erupted a column of light so intense it seared the color from the world. The shockwave that followed knocked us flat. When my vision cleared, I saw that half the plaza was simply gone, swallowed by the earth. The grand nave had collapsed entirely, leaving a yawning chasm that plunged deep into the abyss below. And from that darkness came a sound, a low pulsing rhythm, like a heartbeat magnified 1,000-fold. It resonated through my bones, a reminder that what lay beneath had not been destroyed by the collapse. It was rising. Erenos staggered to his feet beside me, face streaked with ash and blood. "This is no longer a cathedral," he rasped. "It is a gate, and it is opening." Even as he spoke, the remnants of the spire began to shift again, forming a spiraling stairway that descended into the newly revealed depths. I felt the pull of it, a sickening inevitability. The way forward was clear. There would be no retreat, no rescue, not until we descended into the darkness to confront whatever had been waiting there since time immemorial. I gave the order to move, my voice drowned beneath the rising hum of the awakened cathedral. The ground beneath us trembled once more as we began our descent, leaving the broken world above behind, and plunging into the abyss where the true heart of this nightmare awaited. The first steps down the spiraling staircase were taken in silence, save for the distant steady pulse echoing from the depths below. The remnants of the plaza above faded quickly into shadow, the pale light of the shattered sky swallowed by the oppressive gloom. The stone beneath our boots was slick with ash and some darker substance that clung stubbornly to the soles, making each step feel unsteady, treacherous. The staircase wound downward in a perfect spiral, each curve identical to the last, its symmetry unnerved. The further we descended, the more difficult it became to measure distance or time. At first I counted our steps to keep a sense of progression. 100, 200, 300, yet no end appeared. The monotony gnawed at us, the air thickening until our breaths came shallow and labored. The hum from below grew louder, vibrating through the stone and into our bones. It was not merely sound, it was rhythm, alive and purposeful, as if the cathedral itself had a heartbeat. Erenos led us, Crozius raised, his voice rising intermittently in fragments of prayer. Behind him, Meriden muttered feverishly, his words jumbled and incoherent, switching between Imperial Gothic and something far older. I tried to focus on the present, but unease coiled within me. The walls of the stairwell were unmarked, utterly smooth as though they had been grown rather than carved. There were no seams, no evidence of construction, and yet there was a subtle pulsing distortion that made my vision swim if I stared too long. Then came the first sign that something was wrong with more than just the architecture. We reached a landing that should have been the first break in the spiral, a simple platform with branching paths, but as we stepped onto it, a strange vertigo overtook me. When I blinked, the others were frozen mid-step, their forms flickering like reflections in water. I blinked again, and they were normal. Nothing had changed, or so I thought. It was Eranos who noticed it first. "Inquisitor," he said hoarsely, pointing at the wall. The frescoes carved into the stone were wrong. They depicted saints and martyrs, yes, but their positions were reversed from what we had seen before, their faces twisted into silent scream. The corridor behind us had changed as well. The number of skulls mounted along the stairs railing was different. I counted them twice to be certain. Where there had been 7 skulls before, there were now 6. We continued cautiously, descending further, only to arrive at another landing that mirrored the previous one exactly. This time, the frescoes were missing entirely, the stone bare and slick. One of the Mechanicus tech priests scanned the area, his auspex crackling with "Loop detected," he reported, voice trembling with mechanical distortion, spatial repetition. "We are being cycled." His words proved true when, moments later, Meriden vanished. One heartbeat he was there, the next he was gone, leaving only his weapon clattering to the step. Eranos bellowed his name, his voice echoing strangely, but there was no reply. Then, ahead of us, we saw him, or rather, a version of him, descending a few steps below, identical in every way. His lips moved soundlessly, eyes wide with terror, and then he flickered and disappeared again. Panic clawed at the group. One of the Mechanicus broke formation, scrambling upward in a futile attempt to escape. He vanished mid-step, his body dissolving into motes of ash that swirled briefly before being carried downward by the unnatural draft. I forced the survivors to focus, my voice cutting through the rising hysteria. "Do not run. The pattern feeds on disarray. Stay with me." The staircase itself began to change as we obeyed, each step subtly shifting beneath our feet. The curvature deepened, the incline steepened, and soon we were half crawling, half sliding downward as if the spiral were trying to draw us faster toward its heart. My auspex unit flickered erratically, briefly showing multiple overlapping readings of ourselves, as though countless versions of this descent were occurring simultaneously, stacked atop one another like layers of a hymn sung in dissonance. The darkness below brightened faintly as we neared the bottom. At first, it seemed like light, but it was not illumination in any natural sense. It was a glow that hurt the eyes, a radiance that emanated not from fire or lumen but from sheer wrongness. The hum had become deafening, each pulse accompanied by a tightening in my chest, as if my heart struggled to match the beat. When we finally stepped off the staircase, the ground beneath us was soft, yielding slightly like damp flesh. Before us stretched a vast circular chamber. In its center hung an object so alien, my mind recoiled at the sight, a massive, pulsating relic shaped like a heart, suspended in midair by chains of golden bone. It throbbed in time with the hum, each beat sending ripples through the walls and floor. Eranos fell to his knees, whispering prayers that broke halfway through into sobs. The Mechanicus stood frozen, their mechanical limbs locking as their machine spirits overloaded. I forced myself forward, every step a battle against the oppressive weight of the chamber's presence. Behind us, the staircase crumbled, the steps dissolving into a fine mist that drifted upward, sealing off any retreat. We were trapped. As I stared at the relic, a horrifying realization crept over me. This was the cathedral's true heart, both literal and symbolic. It was not a sacred object, to be revered. It was a prison lock, a key, and a living thing all at once, and it was waking. The heart convulsed, and with a sound like tearing fabric, several of the golden bone chains snapped, one after another. The hum became a roar, deafening and absolute. In that moment, I understood the terrible truth. We had not merely descended into the cathedral, we had been swallowed whole, and now, like prey in a great beast's stomach, we were about to be digested. The roar from the chains reverberated through my bones, a guttural vibration that felt like it came from inside my skull rather than the chamber around us. The heart-shaped relic pulsed wildly, its grotesque surface slick with a sheen that resembled both blood and molten gold. Each beat seemed to tug at the air itself, pulling it inward, and releasing it in a single thunderous exhale. The walls of the chamber expanded and contracted with the rhythm, like the ribcage of some vast slumbering creature. The golden bone chains that still held the relic strained visibly, groaning under forces no mortal forge could have prepared them to withstand. Eranos clutched his Crozius, as if it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. His voice, ragged and weak, broke through the deafening hum, as he muttered a constant stream of litanies. Meriden knelt beside him, hands clasped tightly, face wet with tears. The Mechanicus tech priests were silent, their heads tilted upward at unnatural angles, ocular implants dilating and contracting in erratic patterns. One of them emitted a continuous burst of benheric static, a metallic keening like the wail of a machine mourning its own death. I forced myself forward, though every instinct screamed to flee. Each step toward the relic was like walking into a storm. My skin prickled with an energy that burned and froze simultaneously, and the weight of invisible pressure pressed down on my shoulder. My Vox unit sparked violently, discharging a burst of distorted voices that blended together into a maddening chorus. Among the fragments, I heard my own voice, calm and steady, issuing orders I had never given. The closer I came, the more detail I saw in the relic's hideous design. It was not a heart in the anatomical sense, but rather a symbolic construct of flesh, bone and crystal, shaped by intention rather than biology. In its pulsating surface, I glimpsed faces, countless faces, emerging and dissolving like bubbles rising through some were human, others unrecognizable, their features warped into grotesque parodies of devotion and despair. I reached out without realizing it, my hand trembling as it neared the relic's surface. The instant my skin made contact, the chamber vanished. Suddenly, I stood amid a vast void, lit only by starlight, a black ocean stretching endlessly beneath my feet. From this ocean, towers of cathedral stone rose and fell like the spines of some titanic beast. The structures were not built, they grew, shifting and folding in patterns too precise to be random, yet too alien to be human design. I saw them assemble themselves into the shape of the cathedral above, not once, but countless times. Each iteration slightly different, as though the universe itself were rehearsing its own damnation. Images flooded my mind, disjointed and overwhelming. I saw pilgrims kneeling before altars that were also mouths. I saw imperial banners raised high over spires that pulsed like living flesh. And beyond that, in the darkness between the stars, I saw something vast and formless, a presence so immense that the galaxy itself seemed like a mote of dust caught in its breath. The cathedral was not a monument to the emperor. It was a trap, a lure cast into the void to contain something older than mankind's first steps among the stars. The vision shifted, focusing on the Great Crusade. I saw the first human settlers arriving on this world, their ships shining like specks of light against a planet already marked by the lattice of an ancient design. They believed themselves builders of faith and civilization, ignorant that they were merely laying new layers atop a structure that had been here since time immemorial. The original architects were gone, consumed or escaped, leaving only the prison they had built and the echoes of their final ritual. The Emperor's faithful had merely moved into a cage already occupied by a beast they could not comprehend. The pressure in my skull grew unbearable. I staggered, clutching my head, but the vision did not relent. I saw the truth of the relic. It was not a sacred object to be venerated, but the final keystone of the prison, the heart of the lattice. Its pulse maintained the barrier between this world and the thing beyond. And now, with every beat, the barrier weakened. The cathedral had not been corrupted by outside forces. It had always been a weapon, a memory engine built to channel guilt, faith and confession into the containment ritual. Our prayers had not been for salvation, they had been fuel. The vision ended with a violent snap, hurling me back into my body. I gasped, collapsing to my knees. The chamber swam before my eyes, distorted by waves of heat and shadow. Eranos knelt beside me, shaking my shoulders, shouting words I could not hear over the pounding roar. Then, as I focused, I realized what had changed. Several of our number were gone. No sign of their bodies remained. No blood, no ash, nothing. They had simply ceased to exist, as though they had been plucked out of reality entirely. The Mechanicus scanned wildly, their auspexes returning only static and impossible readings. The relic pulsed faster now, each beat accompanied by a tremor that sent dust raining from the chamber ceiling. Eranos turned his haunted gaze toward me. "Inquisitor," he rasped, his voice nearly drowned out by the hum. "It's breaking free." Even as he spoke, a new sound emerged beneath the heartbeat, a whispering chorus rising from the depths below, the same impossible chant we had first heard on the recording. It was no longer faint or distant, it was everywhere, inside our skulls, beneath our skin, a language older than the stars themselves. The last golden chain snapped, the relic surged upward, filling the chamber with a blinding sickly light. For one breathless moment it hovered above us like a newborn star, then it beat once, a single thunderous pulse that hurled us to the ground and extinguished every lumen and vox. When the darkness returned, several more of my retinue were simply gone, and from the void below, something vast and unseen began to rise. The darkness that followed the relic's final pulse was absolute, suffocating in its completeness. It was not the mere absence of light, but a consuming void that seemed to press against my eyes and ears, swallowing thought as easily as it devoured sight. I could hear nothing, not even my own breathing, until a ragged gasp tore free of my throat, and the sound was wrong, too loud, too close, as if it had been caught and reflected back to me by an unseen mouth. Somewhere in that infinite black, Eranos whispered my name, his voice trembled. I reached for him, but my hand found only empty air. Then the whispers began. They rose from the floor, the walls, perhaps even from within my skull, a cacophony of voices overlapping into an unbearable chorus. Some were familiar, my acolytes, the Mechanicus priests, pilgrims I had interrogated in distant hives. Others were strangers, speaking tongues I did not know, and beneath them all a single unifying cadence pulsed in perfect rhythm with the beating of my own heart. It was the same chant we had heard from the first recordings, now magnified 1,000-fold, eroding every barrier of will and faith. Shapes emerged in the darkness, not through light but through memory. I saw corridors we had walked earlier, passages long collapsed, faces of comrades long dead. They flickered like dying lumen flames, shifting between past and present until my senses rebelled. When I reached for one of the figures, my hand passed through it, and for an instant I felt my own skin from the other side, as though I were touching a reflection of myself that did not belong to this moment. Meridan's scream cut through the void. I turned toward the sound and froze. Before me knelt 3 versions of him, each identical, each whispering confessions that overlapped into incoherence. One was young and unscarred, one bore the burns he had suffered on Durok's world, and the last was as I knew him now, gaunt and hollow-eyed. They merged suddenly, collapsing into a black puddle that quivered, sprouting brief, ephemeral shapes, the wings of the Imperial Aquila, a skull, a weeping face. Then it evaporated, with a hiss, leaving only the stench of ash and charred incense. Eranos staggered into view, blood streaming from his ears. "It feeds," he croaked, his voice barely audible over the chant. "It feeds on memory, on every sin, every prayer. We are its offering." His crozius glimmered faintly, the last spark of light in this place. "The cathedral isn't built from stone, it's built from us." The Mechanicus priests were not so fortunate. One stood rigid, his head thrown back as if in ecstasy. From his mouth spilled a steady stream of words in binary cant, though his vox had been destroyed hours ago. The other tore at his own flesh, carving runes into his skin that shifted even as they were cut, never settling into a final form. With a sudden, wet crack, both collapsed into heaps of fragmented bone and metal. The fragments scuttled away on tiny jointed limbs like insects, disappearing into the dark. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling, until I struck a surface that had not been there before. It was smooth and cold, like glass. When I turned, I saw a perfect reflection of myself staring back. But this was not a mirror. The figure moved before I did, its lips already forming words I had not yet spoken. In its eyes burned a vision of what was to come. The Inquisition fleet in orbit above this world, ships tearing apart one another in a silent ballet of destruction, their debris falling like burning tears through the planet's atmosphere. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This hasn't happened." The reflection leaned closer, its breath fogging the unseen barrier between us. "It will," it replied in my voice, calm and certain. Then it dissolved into a swarm of black motes that seeped into my skin, leaving a memory that was not mine, but felt more real than my own thoughts. Behind me, Eranos cried out. I spun to see him kneeling, surrounded by shifting silhouettes. They were versions of him, just as Meridan's had been, each confessing sins aloud. Their words were fragmented and impossible, overlapping until they formed a single sentence that struck me like a physical blow. "The sinner and the sin are one." I understood that this place was not merely a prison, it was a crucible. It consumed memory and guilt, shaping them into physical form, feeding on the endless cycle of confession and punishment. It had no need for time or space, because both were raw materials here, sculpted and discarded at will. Eranos raised his crozius with trembling hands and shouted a final prayer. His body burst into flame, white and pure, burning away the shadows around us for a single heartbeat. In that flash of light, I saw the truth of the chamber, a vast pit lined with spires of bone and crystal, each one bearing countless screaming faces, trapped within. The relic above was only the law, the real hunger was beneath, an ocean of devouring thought that had been waiting for centuries. The light died, and Eranos was gone, consumed utterly, his sacrifice leaving only a scorched mark on the floor. Alone now, I stood on the edge of the pit as the chant reached a crescendo. My memories, my sins, my victories, all rose from my mind like smoke, pulled into the abyss below. I fought to hold on to them, clutching at fragments of who I was, but they slipped through my grasp. In the end, only one thought remained, sharp and unyielding. This was never meant to be stopped. It was meant to From the depths of the pit came a single booming word, spoken in a language older than stars, but understood instinctively by my soul: relief.
The floor beneath me cracked, and the cathedral shuddered as if taking a breath. I realized, with cold clarity, that it no longer mattered whether I lived or died. My memories were already part of it, and soon, the entire sector would be as well. The floor split open beneath my feet, jagged fissures racing outward like cracks in a pane of glass. From each rupture spilled black smoke that moved with purpose, coiling upward into the chamber. The chant that had been rising within the pit broke apart into 1,000 individual voices, each distinct, each speaking in tones of agony, ecstasy, and wrath. The word release was repeated endlessly, layered into a symphony of unbearable clarity. I stumbled back toward the nearest wall, my boots sinking into the soft, pulsing stone. It was no longer a structure at all. It was flesh, it was thought, it was sin given form. Before me the smoke began to gather, taking shape as though sculpted by unseen hands. At first it was formless, a shifting storm of shadow and ash. Then details emerged, limbs of bone and torn vestments, torsos composed of relic fragments, skulls and censers fused together. It towered over me, a creature stitched from every piece of the cathedral, every memory it had devoured, a living monument to guilt. Its head was an ever-shifting mask of faces. Some I recognized: Meridan, the lost Mechanicus, Eranos himself. Others I did not, pilgrims and penitents swallowed long before our arrival. I raised my weapon on instinct and fired. The shots vanished into the thing as though into water, ripples spreading through its form before settling again. There was no wound, no reaction, only the steady, rhythmic motion of its limbs. The chant ceased abruptly. The sudden silence was deafening. The creature's faceless head tilted toward me, and for a heartbeat, I felt as though I stood at the edge of a vast, infinite abyss. In that moment, I understood its nature. It was not merely a being, it was the cathedral itself, condensed into a single body. The architecture, the rituals, the worshippers, all had been leading to this. It was the final confession, the sin ascendant. Behind me, one of the remaining acolytes screamed and fled, sprinting toward the chamber's edge. He did not make it 3 steps before the creature extended a limb. It did not strike or seize him. It merely touched his back with a finger formed of bone and gold. In an instant he folded inward like paper, collapsing into a flat image of himself that dissolved into a flurry of ash. The sound it made was soft, almost tender, like a sigh. Eranos's Crozius lay where he had fallen, its head still faintly glowing. I snatched it up, gripping the weapon tightly as I backed away. My voice cracked as I shouted litanies of banishment, words I had spoken 100 times before, now rendered hollow by the enormity of what stood before me. The sin ascendant moved again, its limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy, like marionette strings pulled by hands outside of reality. Then I understood what it demanded. This entire journey, every death, every ritual, the cathedral had been feeding on confession. It did not want to be fought. It wanted to be acknowledged. It wanted its sins spoken aloud. My voice faltered as the realization struck me. The only path forward was not through strength or faith, but through surrender to the truth it sought to birth. The thing's many faces opened their mouths simultaneously, and from them came a single word: speak. I hesitated, my mind a battlefield of duty and terror. If I obeyed, I would become part of it, another fragment in its endless song. If I resisted, I would be erased as the acolyte had been, my existence stripped away entirely. The choice was no choice at all. With shaking breath, I began to speak, not prayers, not benedictions, but truths I had never dared utter. I confessed to failures buried deep beneath my service to the Emperor. I named the innocent lives I had sacrificed for expediency, the heresies I had concealed to preserve stability, the doubts that had plagued me in the darkest hours of my duty. Each word was agony. My body convulsed as though torn apart by invisible claws. The chamber pulsed with every confession, the walls shuddering, the floor rippling beneath my feet. The sin ascendant swayed like a tree in a storm, its form growing clearer, more solid, fed by the weight of my word. Behind me, I heard the faint, strangled voices of my surviving companions, as they too began to confess, drawn into the same dreadful compulsion. The air thickened with their secrets, forming tangible threads of light that wound upward into the creature's body. Its limbs stretched wider, its head rising higher, until it nearly touched the unseen ceiling above. The chanting returned, softer now, almost reverent. The creature stepped aside, its many faces turning as one to regard me. It had been sated, at least for now. Where it had stood a moment before, the floor split open to reveal a final descent, a narrow passageway leading into a sphere of absolute blackness, so dark it seemed to devour the light around it. I staggered forward, the crozius heavy in my hand, my heart pounding with terror and grim resolve. This was the last threshold. Beyond it lay either the salvation of this world, or its complete and utter undoing. As I approached the edge, the sin ascendant bent its many heads, and whispered one last time, its voices overlapping in a sound that was almost like a prayer. "Go below." Finished the confession. Then it dissolved into smoke and ash, leaving me alone before the abyss, knowing that the true heart of this nightmare awaited within. The passageway descended at a steep angle, narrow and claustrophobic, as though carved not by tools but by the very act of being remembered. The walls were smooth and cold beneath my gloved hand, faintly slick like polished bone. Behind me, the remnants of my retinue followed in silence, their footsteps swallowed by the oppressive stillness. Even the echoes of our movement seemed reluctant to exist here. The air grew heavier with every step, until each breath burned in my lungs like inhaling molten metal. I no longer felt certain where my body ended, and the cathedral began. The tunnel ended abruptly at the edge of a vast, perfectly spherical chamber. There was no light source, no visible architecture, only a darkness so complete that it seemed to bend the mind when gazed upon for too long. My lumen flared and died the instant I crossed the threshold, leaving me in a void absent of color or form. At first, I thought I had gone blind, but then I realized my eyes were open, and what I perceived now was not sight but thought, raw and unfiltered. A whisper stirred at the edge of perception. It was not sound, but memory. The voice was my own, though I had never spoken the words before. "Enter," it urged. My feet moved without my consent, carrying me into the heart of the sphere. The moment I stepped fully inside, the blackness erupted with impossible visions. I stood on the cathedral's steps on the day of my induction into the Inquisition, surrounded by banners and incense, the Emperor's name ringing out from countless throats. Then, with a blink, the scene dissolved into another memory, this time of a battlefield drenched in blood and fire, where I had ordered orbital bombardment on a loyalist settlement to prevent their capture by heretics. My stomach churned as both images overlapped, blending into a single twisted moment where celebration and slaughter were indistinguishable. Every step forward birthed a new memory, but not all were mine. I saw visions of pilgrims long dead, of mechanicus priests, grafted into living machines, of faceless beings that had never been human. The sphere was a crucible of thought, an archive of every sin and secret this place had consumed across millennia. The memories did not simply display themselves, they pressed against me, trying to seep into my mind and overwrite my own history. For a moment I felt my name dissolve, my identity eroding into a sea of countless voices. Then the floor beneath me rippled like water, and I fell to my knees as the sphere's true purpose revealed itself. The darkness coalesced into forms, vast and titanic, towering over me. These were not gods, not daemons as the ecclesiarchy defined them, but something older, more abstract. They were concepts given shape: guilt, fear, faith, and hunger, locked in an eternal struggle. Their bodies were made of fragments of memory, endless layers of confession and denial woven into a tapestry so intricate, it defied comprehension. One of the titanic forms lowered itself toward me, its face a shifting mass of thousands of eyes and mouths. From every mouth came a single, unified word in a language I had never heard, yet instinctively understood. The chamber vibrated with the command, my bones rattling in my flesh. I understood now. The cathedral was not merely a prison for some ancient entity, it was an engine designed to trap and bind these abstract forces, using human memory and confession as its chain. The walls of faith, the rituals of guilt, the endless cycles of worship, they were the mechanism that kept the darkness contained, and those chains were failing. As the realization sank in, the floor began to dissolve beneath me, replaced by a mirror-like surface, reflecting not the sphere but my own mind. Memories surfaced unbidden, the faces of those I had condemned, the screams of worlds I had burned in the Emperor's name. I saw myself kneeling before the throne,
swearing eternal loyalty, even as a shadow lingered behind me, whispering doubts I had never dared acknowledge. Then the visions shifted. The reflection no longer showed the past but what was to come. I saw the Imperial fleet in orbit, ships tearing each other apart as madness consumed their crews. I saw hive cities across the sector collapsing inward, their spires twisting into spines of bone. And finally, I saw myself standing at the heart of it all, my mouth open in a silent scream as the cathedral rose into the void like a crown of teeth. I staggered back, but there was nowhere to flee. The sphere pulsed, and the titanic forms around me began to merge, their outlines blurring into a single overwhelming presence. It reached toward me, not with hands but with the weight of inevitability. I understood then that this was why the Inquisition had been sent here, why all the bloodshed and secrecy had been necessary. We were not here to cleanse a corruption, we were here to be the final offering. The presence leaned close, its countless mouths opening in perfect harmony. The word came again, deafening now, etched into my very soul. Release. The mirror beneath me shattered, and I fell, not through space, but through memory itself. As I plunged, I heard the screams of my retinue fading into the void, their voices joining the countless others that had come before. Somewhere above, far beyond reach, the cathedral exhaled like a living thing, and I knew that the final seal had been broken. When I struck the ground, there was no pain, only silence, vast and eternal. Then slowly, a heartbeat began to echo in the darkness, no longer the rhythm of the relic, but my own, now entwined with the hunger of the sphere. And with that realization came the cold certainty that I had not escaped the prison. I had become part of it. The silence was deceptive, fragile like a thin sheet of glass waiting to shatter. My body felt weightless, as though my bones had been hollowed out, yet every nerve screamed with the awareness of what lay around me. I rose unsteadily, breath ragged, and found myself standing on a platform that seemed suspended above nothing. The void stretched infinitely in all directions, and from that void rose the faint outlines of the cathedral, as it had been: spires, altars, corridors, ghostly, half-formed, as though memory itself were rebuilding it before my eyes. But it was no longer a place of worship. It was a living lattice of guilt and hunger, each pillar a column of woven sin. Above me, the titanic presence shifted. Its form was a storm of shadows and faces, constantly merging and breaking apart. From within its mass came the sound of chains straining, links snapping one by one in a deafening rhythm that echoed through my skull. Each break sent tremors through the platform, threatening to pitch me into the abyss. It was awakening fully now, and I understood the truth with perfect clarity. If the last chain broke, the entity would not merely escape this world, it would spread across the stars, rewriting the Imperium into a cathedral of its own design. Behind me, a ragged scream tore through the dark. I turned to see the last of my surviving acolytes clutching his head, his form flickering like a broken hololith. Memories spilled from him as visible light, threads of glowing confession unspooling into the void. He looked at me with tear-streaked eyes before dissolving completely, his very existence consumed by the lattice. His final words were a whisper, carried by the currents of the void. "Forgive me." I stumbled forward, gripping Eranos's fallen Crozius like a lifeline. Its head glimmered faintly, the last ember of Imperial faith in this place. With every step the platform beneath me shuddered, fragments breaking away into the blackness below. The presence leaned closer, a vast tide of mouths opening in anticipation. "Release," it intoned again, a single word spoken not as request but as command. I knew then what was required of me. To reseal the lattice, to halt this ascension, I would have to complete the ritual, but not with relics or incantations. It demanded life, memory, guilt, a total offering. The realization struck with a cold certainty. I must give myself to the cathedral, not as prey but as architect. By becoming the final confessor, I could lock the chains once more, though at the cost of everything I was and had. The platform began to collapse around me, chunks falling away into endless dark. I ran, leaping across gaps, each motion a battle against the crushing weight of the entity's will. As I neared the central nexus, the lattice became visible beneath my feet, golden chains stretching outward in all directions, each link engraved with countless names and sins. Most had already shattered, their broken fragments drifting like dead stars. Only a single chain remained intact, pulsing faintly with residual light. From the void below, hands emerged, thousands of them, skeletal and robed, reaching upward. They grasped at my legs, my arms, not to harm me, but to pull me down into their endless their mouths moved soundlessly, yet I heard every confession in my mind, the unspoken guilt of entire worlds. The cacophony nearly drove me mad. My own memories bled into theirs until I could no longer tell where I ended, and they began. The presence surged upward, a wall of shadow and bone. Its voices became a singular roar. The last chain trembled, its glow dimming, ready to break. I raised the crozius high, and shouted my final confession, a torrent of truths I had buried beneath decades of duty. The words tore themselves from my throat like living things, each syllable a fragment of my soul cast into the lattice. The crozius blazed with unnatural light, brighter than any lumen. The hands released me, the final chain solidified for a heartbeat, resisting the pull of the void. I drove the crozius into its center, pouring everything I was into that single act. Pain consumed me, not physical but spiritual, as if every moment of my existence were being peeled away and grafted into the cathedral's design. The presence screamed, a sound of infinite rage and hunger. The void convulsed, folding in upon itself as the lattice reknit. Spires of bone shot upward, re-establishing the prison's boundaries. The platform beneath me cracked, sending shards of reality cascading into the dark. My vision blurred, fading as the cathedral sealed itself once more. With my final breath, I saw the last chain lock into place. The presence was dragged downward, its form unraveling into fragments of shadow. The roar diminished to a whisper, then silence. The lattice was whole again, but I no longer existed apart from it. I was memory, I was guilt, I was the confessor, eternal, far above. I sensed my surviving acolytes fleeing through collapsing corridors, their minds mercifully purged of what had transpired here. They would tell no tales, for there were none left to tell. Only coordinates marked in secret, a warning to never return. As the darkness closed over me, a single distant heartbeat echoed through the cathedral. It was not mine anymore, it was the Imperium's, and it would never stop. The silence after the collapse was almost more terrifying than the roars that had preceded it. When I opened my eyes, I no longer stood upon a lattice of golden chains, or before the abyss of endless confession. Instead, there was only it stretched in every direction, a pale and lifeless expanse beneath a sky, so colorless it seemed scraped bare of meaning. The cathedral was gone. Where once had risen towers of bone and stone and faith, there was now a flat, featureless plain, as if reality itself had been scoured clean. The wind moved sluggishly across it, carrying with it faint whispers that faded before they could form words. I turned in a slow circle, disoriented. Behind me, the remnants of my retinue emerged one by one from the drifting fog of ash. Their eyes were blank, their expressions vacant, as though some vital part of them had been stripped away in the final sealing. They did not look at me, they did not speak, they simply trudged forward, guided by instincts older than memory. Erinos was gone, his name already fading from their minds as if he had never been. Even Meridan's face was difficult to recall now, blurred by the erasure of the ritual. In the distance, I saw the first outlines of Imperial Guard formations moving into position. Rows of tanks and infantry stretched across the horizon, their banners fluttering weakly in the dead air. Vox towers rose like skeletal fingers, their signals choked by static. The guard formed a cordon around the site, weapons ready but silent. I knew these men and women had been given no explanation, only orders to secure a location now marked as forbidden. None would dare question, none would dare cross the ash plain. As I approached their lines, a senior officer met me, his face hidden behind a rebreather mask. His voice was clipped and emotionless, as he recited his orders. By decree of the Inquisition, this zone is under planetary interdiction. No one enters, no one leaves. His eyes flicked briefly to the empty horizon behind me, where the cathedral had once stood. What happened here will not be recorded. I gave him a single nod. There were no words left to speak, and even if there had been, they would have been meaningless now. The officer saluted sharply and withdrew, leaving me alone at the edge of the plain. The surviving members of my retinue were taken away in silence, their memories already unraveling, their identities dissolving into blank obedience. They would live, but they would never again be whole. From a secure vault within the guard's command post, I transmitted my final report. It was brief, stripped of all detail, a single set of coordinates marked in red. My final words to the Ordo Malleus were simple: site sealed, sin contained, return forbidden. I encrypted the file and locked it beneath layers of clearance, so high that even my successors would struggle to find it. Some places were not meant to be known. That night, I stood alone at the boundary of the ash plain, staring out over the featureless landscape. In the distance, The wind shifted the ash into shallow dunes. For a moment, I imagined I saw spires rising again, faint outlines taking shape beneath the surface. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a mind frayed by too much exposure to the wall. But the longer I watched, the more certain I became that the cathedral was not truly gone. It was only sleeping, waiting for the next confession. A movement caught my eye. Near the center of the plain, a lone figure knelt, hands clasped, head. At first, I thought it was one of my lost acolytes, somehow returned, but as I drew closer, I saw it was a pilgrim, one of the countless faithful, who had once thronged these halls. His lips moved silently, forming words no human tongue should know. When the wind carried his voice to me, I heard the same impossible chant that had begun this nightmare, soft and steady, rising from the ash like the first notes of a hymn. I turned away, unwilling to hear more. Behind me, the Vox towers crackled faintly, their signals straining against the silence. In my mind, the memory of the cathedral's heartbeat pulsed once, faint and distant. It would never truly end. The cycle would continue, as it always had. As I boarded the waiting shuttle, I looked back one final time. The ash plain seemed calm, still, almost peaceful, but beneath that deceptive surface, I felt the weight of countless unseen eyes watching. The last words of my report echoed in my thoughts as the shuttle lifted off, carrying me away from the place where faith and guilt had become one. Sin cannot be destroyed, I thought bitterly, only named. And far below, hidden beneath the drifting ash, the whispers began again.